There are moments in history when one person stands against a system so powerful that resistance seems impossible. In the middle of the 20th century, South Africa was ruled by a government that divided people by the color of their skin, stripping millions of their rights, their dignity, and even their freedom. Most believed that challenging such an oppressive regime would only lead to imprisonment or death. Yet, from a small rural village emerged a young man whose determination would eventually reshape not only his nation, but also inspire the entire world. His name was Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, and his journey would become one of the greatest stories of courage, sacrifice, and reconciliation ever recorded. Before he became a global symbol of peace, Mandela was simply a curious boy growing up among the rolling hills of Mbizo in the Eastern Cape. Born on July 18, 1918, into the Thembu royal family, he inherited traditions of leadership, responsibility, and respect for justice. His birth name, Rolihlahla, loosely translated as pulling the branch of a tree, also carried the meaning of a troublemaker, a title that would prove strangely prophetic. At a local Methodist school, a teacher assigned him the English name Nelson, reflecting the colonial customs of the era. As he matured, Mandela witnessed firsthand how racial discrimination shaped every aspect of South African society. Black citizens faced harsh restrictions on where they could live, work, travel, and receive education, while a privileged white minority controlled the country's political and economic power. These injustices left a lasting impression on the young Mandela, planting the seeds of resistance long before he entered politics. After studying at the University of Fort Hare and later in Johannesburg, he encountered activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens determined to challenge inequality. Every experience strengthened his belief that freedom could never be granted willingly by an unjust system. It had to be earned through courage, unity, and relentless determination. Unaware of the extraordinary challenges awaiting him, Mandela was about to begin a journey that would test his spirit beyond imagination and forever alter the course of South African history. As the 1940s unfolded, Nelson Mandela transformed from a determined law student into a passionate activist who believed that silence in the face of injustice was no longer an option. Johannesburg exposed him to the harsh realities of apartheid, a system designed to separate races and preserve white minority rule through strict laws and relentless discrimination. Black South Africans were forced to carry passbooks, denied the right to vote, and removed from their homes whenever the government declared an area for white occupation. Working alongside fellow lawyer Oliver Tambo, Mandela helped establish South Africa's first Black-owned law firm, offering legal assistance to countless people who had nowhere else to turn. Every client who walked through their office doors carried another painful story of injustice, strengthening Mandela's resolve to challenge the system. In 1944, he joined the African National Congress, commonly known as the ANC, and became a founding member of its Youth League. Alongside Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and other young leaders, Mandela advocated for stronger and more organized resistance against apartheid. Peaceful protests, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience gained momentum during the Defiance Campaign of 1952, drawing thousands of ordinary citizens into the struggle for equality. The South African government responded with arrests, surveillance, and increasing restrictions on political activists. Mandela himself was repeatedly detained, banned from attending public meetings, and prohibited from addressing large gatherings. Yet every attempt to silence him only expanded his influence. In 1955, the Congress of the People adopted the Freedom Charter, declaring that South Africa belonged to all who lived in it, regardless of race or background. The document became a powerful vision for a democratic future, but authorities viewed it as a direct threat. In 1956, Mandela and more than 150 activists were arrested and charged with treason. Although the lengthy treason trial eventually ended in acquittal years later, it consumed valuable time and resources while revealing the government's determination to crush the growing movement. Meanwhile, racial tensions continued to escalate across the nation, bringing South Africa closer to one of the most decisive turning points in its modern history. Mandela's path was becoming increasingly dangerous, and the choices he would soon make would alter the course of his life forever. The events of 1960 marked a dramatic turning point in Nelson Mandela's life and in South Africa's struggle for freedom. On March 21st, police opened fire on a peaceful protest against the passed laws in Sharpeville, killing 69 people and injuring many more. The tragedy shocked the world and exposed the brutality of apartheid with undeniable clarity. In response, the South African government declared a state of emergency, banned the African National Congress, and intensified its crackdown on political opposition. Convinced that peaceful protest alone could no longer bring change under such violent repression, Mandela and several ANC leaders made the difficult decision to establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation, in 1961. The organization focused on acts of sabotage against government infrastructure while seeking to avoid civilian casualties, believing these actions were a last resort after years of peaceful resistance had been met with force. As one of its leading figures, Mandela secretly traveled across Africa and abroad to gain political support and receive military training before returning to South Africa in disguise. Because of his ability to evade the authorities, newspapers began calling him the Black Pimpernel. His freedom, however, would not last. On August 5, 1962, Mandela was arrested near Howick after months of surveillance. He was first sentenced for leaving the country without permission and encouraging workers to strike. While he was already in prison, police raided Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia, uncovering documents that linked senior ANC leaders to plans against the apartheid government. Mandela and his colleagues were placed on trial in what became known as the Rivonia Trial. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Mandela delivered one of the most powerful speeches in modern history on April 20, 1964. Declaring that he had fought against both white domination and black domination, he spoke of his dream of a democratic and free society where all people could live together with equal opportunities. He ended with the unforgettable words that this ideal was one for which he was prepared to die. Although spared execution, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. As the heavy prison doors closed behind him, a new chapter began, one that would transform a prisoner into one of the world's greatest symbols of hope, resilience, and justice. For Nelson Mandela, prison was intended to be the end of his influence, but it became the place where his legend grew stronger. In 1964, he arrived at Robben Island, a harsh prison surrounded by the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. He was assigned to a tiny cell with little more than a bed, a bucket, and a narrow window. Prisoners performed exhausting labor in a limestone quarry under the relentless South African sun, while guards attempted to break their spirit through humiliation and isolation. Yet Mandela refused to surrender his dignity. Alongside fellow political prisoners, he demanded better treatment and fought for the recognition of their rights. Over the years, the prison became an unlikely school of political education. Mandela and his fellow prisoners debated history, philosophy, politics, and the future of South Africa. He also studied Afrikaans, the language of many of the white officials who govern the country, believing that understanding his opponents was essential to understanding how the system could eventually be dismantled. His relationship with prison guards gradually became more complex, as some came to recognize his discipline and humanity despite the political conflict between them. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Mandela's name became a rallying cry for the anti-apartheid movement. His photograph appeared on posters and banners around the world, while the phrase "Free Nelson Mandela" became a powerful symbol of resistance. International pressure against the South African government continued to grow, with countries imposing sanctions and organizations demanding an end to apartheid. In 1982, Mandela was transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison and later, in 1988, to Victor Verster Prison. These transfers brought him closer to government officials who were beginning to understand that apartheid could not survive indefinitely. Secret discussions between Mandela and representatives of the government slowly began. He understood that South Africa's future would require negotiation, but he refused to abandon the principles of equality and democracy. After spending more than 2 decades behind bars, Mandela had changed. He was no longer simply a political prisoner. He had become the face of a global movement, and the government now faced a difficult question. Could the man they had tried to silence become the person who helped save the nation from civil war? By the late 1980s, the answer was beginning to emerge, and the walls surrounding Mandela were finally starting to come down. On February 11, 1990, the world watched as Nelson Mandela finally walked out of Victor Verster Prison after 27 years behind bars. He stepped through the gates as a free man, but the nation he returned to was still deeply divided and dangerously close to violence. Standing before thousands of supporters in Cape Town, Mandela did not call for revenge. Instead, he called for reconciliation, negotiation, and the creation of a democratic South Africa where every citizen could live with dignity. His release marked the beginning of an extraordinary transformation. Mandela and President F.W. de Klerk entered difficult negotiations to dismantle apartheid and establish a new political system. The process was filled with tension, violence, and uncertainty, but Mandela continued to insist that the future could not be built upon hatred. In 1993, Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to peacefully end apartheid and lay the foundations for democracy. Then, on April 27, 1994, millions of South Africans participated in the country's first democratic election in which people of all races could vote. For Mandela, the moment represented the fulfillment of a dream that had once seemed impossible. On May 10, 1994, he was inaugurated as South Africa's first democratically elected black president. The man who had entered prison as a political prisoner now stood at the center of a nation seeking healing. Yet Mandela understood that political freedom alone could not erase decades of inequality and suffering. Through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and his emphasis on forgiveness, he encouraged South Africans to confront their painful past without allowing it to control their future. His presidency became a symbol of reconciliation, but his greatest legacy was perhaps the principle that true leadership is not measured by the power one gains, but by the hatred one refuses to carry. After leaving office in 1999, Mandela continued working for peace, education, and humanitarian causes, using his global influence to support children and communities in need. He passed away on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, but his story did not end with his death. Nelson Mandela's life remains a reminder that courage can survive decades of oppression, that freedom can emerge from the darkest prison, and that forgiveness can sometimes achieve what revenge never could. His journey from a young boy in a rural South African village to a prisoner, president, and global symbol of hope changed the course of history. And perhaps the greatest lesson of his life is this: a person may be imprisoned, silenced, or forgotten for a time, but an idea rooted in justice can outlive every wall built to contain it.